So
The
your
thesis
first
was
place with the Red Cross was Malawi,
yeah.
and you're doing the thesis.
Yeah, so the thesis was about like predicting which areas would be most affected after a flood, because Malawi suffers from very frequent floods, like every year basically. So the thesis was, I was based in The Hague, but the thesis was about Malawi. And at some point we needed to get more data, because when initially I like they told me that I would write my thesis about typhoons in the Philippines. It's like, that sounds great. You know, we have the data. I've been there, so I was interested.
Right.
Then I arrived, and they're like, well, so we told you that it would probably be about the Philippines, but we're actually thinking about, instead of typhoons, about floods, and instead of the Philippines, about Malawi. So it's like, all right, but like, what kind of data do you have? It's like, well, the thing is, we don't really have any data. I was like, all right, but it seemed interesting, so it's like, all right, well, we'll see. And my professor was quite flexible as well. But then, because we didn't have a lot of data, you would be able to find some things. But eventually, we went there for 2 weeks, and we had meetings with different ministries, also the local Red Cross, other NGOs, to see what kind of data they had. For example, on one example is normally you have a census data that they update every 5 to 10 years, and there's different levels. So you have, let's say you have I don't know how it works in the US, but you have the country level, then you have the states, then below that often you have like
Counties.
So we had, I think, the county level.
Depends on which state, though, because I think in Louisiana they call them parishes. And
all right, yeah.
Other places they might be a province, but most states call them counties.
But so basically, in this way, you would say the country is level 1, then you have a level 2, which is the states, the 3, which is the counties, and then you have a level 4, which is even lower. But you don't, so often the data is aggregated, so you don't always have data on the lowest level.
Right.
So one of the things we wanted to do is, for example, get more detailed data on certain areas, because you actually know a little bit more about poverty levels or differences between areas, or the amount of people that live in a certain area. So that's why I went to Malawi for about 2 weeks, to collect those data, and then come back and use that for the research.
But that's also super important for other things as well, because I saw that when Bill Gates was talking about the Gates Foundation and how they were trying to get all these people vaccinated in Africa, and then turned out there were so many places that weren't on a map. They just didn't know that these people were out there. And so the first time they thought that they had eradicated polio, they hadn't, because
because
there's
they
still people
out
out there. So I think a lot of people who haven't been to these places, we kind of just take for granted that, of course, we know where people are everywhere on the world, but we actually don't. And so it's people like you who are, volunteering with places like the Red Cross, or people getting paid very little with the Gates Foundation. I'm not hating on the Gates Foundation, but there's not so much money to nobody's getting rich from doing this. And so these are actually real people on the ground, going in, finding out how many people live here.
Well, I think what's very interesting about that is you have OpenStreetMap, which is basically like the open source Google Maps, and some people might know it because, like, for example, if they go to Paris and they don't have any internet, they download an OpenStreetMap map of Paris, and then that shows them where the restaurants and the bars are. But how it's also being used is to map houses and buildings in general. So one of the things that the Red Cross was doing, but also other organizations do this, is to basically look at satellite imagery, and then whenever they, like, for example, they take a part and they look if there are houses or buildings there. If there are, like, they physically draw in the buildings, they save it to OpenStreetMaps, and in that way, like, gradually they actually map like whole areas that weren't mapped before. And then now multiple agencies are working, and I think Facebook is actually one of them, are working on finding more digitalized or automated ways of doing that. So just having an algorithm going through all these satellite images, and then drawing in these houses where maybe a person would only have to check if they were done correctly.